You marvel while they ridicule. I mean, just picture that dynamic for a second.
Oh, it's such a visceral image.
Right. You are standing there and you're looking at the absolute elegance of a system. You're seeing the undeniable logic of cause and effect, the sheer rationality of how structural integrity holds a society together, and you are just in awe. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
It clicks. Everything just works.
Exactly. But then the response from the person standing right next to you, a smirk, just a dismissive wave of the hand.
Or, a sarcastic little meme nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. And it feels entirely irrational until you realize it's a strategy. And that specific asymmetry, right? The person who marvels at logic versus the person who mocks it.
That is the exact starting point for what we're tearing into today.
It really is. We are looking at this brilliant, deeply analytical lecture by Allama Parvez, and he's taking a specific section of text from Surah As-Saaffat.
Right, verses 12 through 45.
Yes, and he is completely reframing how we understand it. Because, he doesn't view this text as some ancient mystical standoff between believers and non-believers.
And not at all. He treats it as an anatomy of civilizational collapse. I mean, Parvez is reading this as a purely socioeconomic blueprint.
Which is fascinating.
It is. The mission here is to map out this very specific, devastating trajectory. Like, how does a society that actively chooses mockery over critical thinking inevitably trigger its own systemic failure?
Let's linger on that word, marvel, for a second, from Ayat 12. Because Parvez makes a huge point about it. The marveling isn't about blind faith.
No, it's not. It's the reaction of an intellect that grasps order.
Right. When you see how actions have inevitable consequences, when you understand that a society built on justice thrives and one built on extraction crumbles, you marvel at the mathematical perfection of it.
Yeah, Parvez frames this as an appeal entirely to the intellect. The text is laying out the law of consequences.
And he has a specific term for that, right?
Yeah, he calls this mukafat iamal, the law of retribution, or basically the law of cause and effect. It's the idea that every action in a society leaves a permanent mark on the ledger.
The ledger. I love that analogy.
All right. When a rational mind sees that ledger, it marvels at the fairness. But the opposing side, they mock it.
And they don't mock it because they have a better argument.
Exactly. They mock it because they are heavily invested in the current exploitative system.
Okay, wait, let me push back on this, or at least try to ground it. Because when we talk about entrenched leadership, let's use Parvez's historical example of the Quraysh in Mecca, or honestly, even a modern corporate board.
Sure.
They usually think of themselves as the highly rational ones. They think of the people demanding equity as the naive dreamers, So how is Parvez arguing that the elite are the ones abandoning reason?
Well, think about what happens when a genuinely valid structural critique is brought to the table. Let's say someone proves that a supply chain is fundamentally exploitative. They bring the data. They show that paying workers starvation wages while extracting record profits will, mathematically lead to an economic implosion within a decade.
Right. The math is undeniable.
Exactly. So what does the power broker do? If they engage with the math, they lose.
Because the logic of exploitation is inherently flawed long-term.
Right. So they change the rules of engagement entirely.
They deploy the smirk.
They invalidate the messenger to avoid touching the message. Mockery is the ultimate refuge of the unreasonable.
Oh, wow. That's such a good way to put it.
By laughing at the critic, the power broker signals to their followers that this critique is so beneath them, it doesn't even warrant a spreadsheet. It is a calculated social performance.
It's a smokescreen.
Totally.
It creates the illusion of intellectual superiority without doing any of the intellectual work. I mean, you see this all the time today.
Oh, everywhere.
Someone points out a massive looming crisis in a political system, and the entrenched power just rolls their eyes and drops a dismissive soundbite. They turn the critic into a caricature.
And that mockery usually comes from a profound yet fragile arrogance. Parvez notes a fascinating psychological truth here. The weak do not mock the strong.
Right.
The strong mock the weak, secure in the illusion that their power is permanent and immune to consequences.
That brings up a massive question, though, because if mockery is just the behavioral tick-like, the surface-level symptom of a rotten system, what is the actual disease? What is the core structural belief that a civilization has to internalize to act this way?
That's the real issue.
Because you don't just mock the law of gravity unless you genuinely believe you can jump off a cliff and float.
Exactly. And the core belief is the absolute denial of the ledger.
Okay, untack that.
Parvez extracts this from the disbeliever's taunt in the text. They say, when we die and become dust and bones, shall we really be raised?
Right, the bones and dust argument.
Now, conventionally, historically, this has been read purely as skepticism about a theological afterlife.
Like a literal resurrection.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Parvez flips the script. He translates this entirely into a socioeconomic context. This taunt is the institutional refusal of accountability.
I really love this framing because it strips away the mysticism completely.
He does.
They are essentially saying, you're telling us our actions have consequences. Look around. We are wealthy. We control the trade routes. We are untouchable.
And when it's over, we turn to dust.
Yeah.
There is no audit. The game just ends.
Yeah. It is the institutional internalization of a reset button.
What's fascinating here is, if a civilization fundamentally believes that consequences do not accumulate, that history has no memory, the entire foundation of justice evaporates.
Because why bother?
Exactly. Parvez points out that if this dust and bones mentality takes hold, the only remaining law is might makes right.
Because there's no future reckoning.
Right. The entity that gathers the most resources can act with absolute impunity because they believe tomorrow will never arrive to balance the books.
Okay, let's run a thought experiment on that because I think it's crucial to visualize how dangerous this is.
Let's do it.
Imagine you're playing a highly complex, high-stakes multiplayer game. But the developers tell you up front, hey, every 5 minutes the server's going to completely wipe. The score drops to 0.
Oh, that's chaos.
Total chaos. No penalties carry over, no fouls are recorded, no alliances matter. In that environment, why wouldn't you cheat?
You'd have to, almost.
Right. Why wouldn't you steal from every other player the second their back is turned? The architecture of a zero-consequence timeline incentivizes the most ruthless, extractive behavior imaginable.
That is the perfect modern parallel to what Parvez is analyzing. He isn't talking about spiritual consequences. He's talking about the death of civilizational planning.
Yes.
If a corporate fiscal quarter is the only timeline that exists in the minds of the board, they will strip mine a mountain and work their employees to the bone today.
Because tomorrow's ecological or economic collapse simply isn't on their radar.
Exactly. They believe they'll have cashed out by the time it hits.
It applies to geopolitics too, right? I mean, a superpower can amass immense military strength and act with total impunity.
Oh, absolutely.
They might sit through the theater of international councils, maybe nod along to some resolutions, but practically, they extract whatever they want because they believe their wealth exempts them from the socioeconomic laws of physics.
But Parvez makes a really chilling point here. That illusion of a zero-consequence reality, it works brilliantly for the extractors.
Until it doesn't.
Right up until the system reaches its breaking point. A structure can only absorb so much rot before the rot becomes the structure.
Wow.
And this brings us to the arrival of what the text calls Yom Yilfazal.
The day of decision, or the day of separation.
Yeah.
This is where Parvez's analysis gets incredibly cinematic, but also psychologically intense.
It really is a masterclass in watching a socioeconomic network implode. Parvez describes a staged confrontation.
Okay, paint the picture for us.
The system buckles, and suddenly the oppressors, the Zalim, and their companions are assembled together. And here, Parvez makes a linguistic correction that completely shifts the paradigm of how this text has been understood for centuries.
This part blew my mind.
He zeroes in on the Arabic word azwaj.
Hold on, I want to dig into this because I know azwaj is traditionally translated as wives or spouses.
Right, traditionally.
Which, to be honest, always felt like a bizarre domestic tangent in the middle of a grand civilizational critique. Like, why are we suddenly talking about marriages? How does Parvez justify changing that?
Well, he goes back to the absolute root of the language. The root letters Z, W, G, J refer to a pair, something coupled with another, an associate.
Okay.
Parvez argues that translating it as wives here makes no contextual sense. In a socioeconomic autopsy of a corrupt system, azwaj means companions, associates, partners in crime.
It means the enablers.
Exactly, the enabler.
That distinction changes everything. Because if we are talking about partners in crime, we are looking at the sudden, catastrophic exposure of a patronage network.
Yes, the whole corrupt web.
Well, we aren't looking at families. We're looking at the collapse of false solidarity between the corrupt elite and the people who help them pull it off.
The text describes a moment where they are asked, What is the matter with you that you do not help each other?
Oh, that's brutal.
This is the shatter point. The strongman patron built his entire empire on promising protection and impunity to his clients and enablers.
Because that's the deal, right? You help me exploit, I keep you safe.
Exactly. The alliance was glued together by mutual exploitation and a shared arrogance. But when the structural consequences finally catch up, when the audit actually happens, that glue dissolves instantly.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The patron can't write a check to make the problem go away, so the client just abandons him.
Yeah.
It's the ultimate realization that loyalty bought with extracted wealth isn't loyalty at all. It's a transaction that just bounced.
And Parwez highlights the brutal exchange that follows. It is the blame game at the end of the world. The followers, the masses, the enablers, turn on their leaders and cry out, "You misled us! You brought us to this ruin!"
It's the classic, we were just following orders defense.
Exactly.
We were just powerless pawns in your corrupt machine. But the leaders fire back with an indictment that I actually found really uncomfortable to read. They say, no, you weren't moments yourselves, meaning you weren't upholders of justice either.
I'm glad you find it uncomfortable, because Parwez is intentionally dismantling the most popular narrative in human history, the victim complex of the masses.
Oof, that's heavy.
The leaders are looking at their followers and saying, we only had power because you gave it to us. You were not innocent bystanders. You were passively complicit.
So he's taking aim at the middlemen, the silent majority.
Yes. Parwez is arguing a very hard truth. Systemic oppression literally requires the passive agreement, or at least the fearful silence of the majority.
See, I really struggle with this part. It feels a bit like victim blaming.
I get that.
If a brutal regime has all the weapons and all the money, how can Parwez blame the average person just trying to survive for being complicit? Isn't that demanding an impossible level of heroism from ordinary people?
It's a vital pushback, and a lot of people feel that way. But Parwez is looking at the mechanics of power. A tyrant cannot tyrannize a society that uniformly refuses to be tyrannized.
Okay, I see.
Yes, the exploiters are guilty of the extraction, but Parwez is insisting that accountability is distributed. If the enablers had possessed genuine conviction, if they had truly valued equity over their own safety or over the crumbs they got from the oppressor's table, the system couldn't have functioned.
Let me try to map that onto an analogy.
Go for it.
Let's say there's a corrupt engineering firm building a massive dam above a village. The firm decides to use cheap sand instead of cement to pocket the difference.
A classic cost-cutting corruption scheme.
Exactly. And the villagers see the sand trucks rolling in. They know it's wrong. But the engineering firm is paying a few of the locals well to drive the trucks, and the rest are just too scared to speak up, or they think, well, it probably won't break in my lifetime.
Right, the dust and bones mindset again.
Yes. So when the dam eventually shatters and the village drowns, those villagers can't just point fingers at the executives. Their silence, their willingness to drive the trucks for a paycheck, that was the very mechanism that allowed the fatal flaw to be built.
That is exactly the dynamic Parwez is exposing. The followers didn't want justice. They wanted a share of the exploitation.
Wow.
And when the table flips and the consequences arrive, they suddenly want to play the victim. The confrontation in the text exposes that the entire society was rotten, from the penthouse to the pavement.
So the mockery has failed. The dust and bones denial of consequences has caught up to them. The patronage network has completely shattered, and the false solidarity has dissolved into everyone just screaming at each other.
The whole thing collapses.
The system is dead. But what actually happens to the physical reality of their society? The wealth they hoarded, the institutions they built. What is the final state of it all?
Parwez answers this by contrasting two of the most vivid metaphors in the text. He looks at the harvest of ashes and the flowing spring.
Okay, let's break this down.
When the exploitative system collapses, the oppressors are forced to look at the reality of what they built. The text says they are reduced to hasigan kamadin. Parwez translates this to describe a state like a harvested field or extinguished ashes.
Extinguished ashes. I want to pause on that specific imagery because it's not a crater from a meteor strike.
No.
It's not a pile of rubble from an earthquake. An extinguished ash is something that has burned itself out from the inside.
That internal mechanism is the entire point. An extractive economy is a fire. It requires constant fuel, which means it requires the constant consumption of the marginalized, the constant stripping of resources.
And fire doesn't care what it burns.
Exactly. Eventually, any fire consumes its own foundation. The collapse Parwez is describing is never a punitive lightning bolt thrown from the sky by an angry deity.
It's just math.
It is the mathematical, inescapable end stage of an unsustainable equation. The society literally burns its own future to power its present arrogance. When the fuel runs out, nothing remains but the cold, extinguished ashes of Hasidan Kamedin.
And Parwez contrasts this barren, burned-out wasteland with the outcome of a correctly structured civilization.
Yeah.
And this is where his linguistic brilliance shines again.
Oh, this card is amazing.
He takes the concept of shariat, a word that carries so much heavy, rigid, often punitive baggage today, and he strips it all the way down to its linguistic root.
The recalibration of that word is stunning. He explains that linguistically, shariat simply means the path that leads to a flowing river.
I mean, think about how different that feels.
It changes everything. It is the route to man-unhoarded, freely flowing, abundant water.
Because for a desert civilization, hoarding water is the ultimate form of power. If you control the only well, you are a god. Everyone has to beg you to survive.
Right, you dictate the terms of their existence.
Like a flowing river. A river can't easily be locked up. It flows past everyone's door. It is the democratization of survival.
And that ties directly into Parwez's definition of a just system. A correct civilization provides risk sustenance, but it must be provided with takrim, with absolute human dignity.
Dignity is the key word there.
Parwez makes a brilliant distinction here. Even a beggar gets a piece of bread eventually, but they get it at the total expense of their dignity. They have to grovel for it.
Yes. A functional society doesn't force its citizens to dig their own wells in grueling poverty, begging a patron for access to basic human needs.
No, it structures itself so that resources flow naturally.
There are no choke points controlled by an elite few. That is melamine.
When you look at modern resource hoarding, whether it's monopolies controlling housing, healthcare, clean water, or even digital data, you see the creation of stagnant pools.
Because they've dammed up the river.
Exactly. The majority of people have to bankrupt themselves or surrender their dignity just to access what should be freely flowing. Parwez is arguing that a society operating like that is fundamentally anti-human.
It goes against the natural flow of a healthy system.
The flowing water of Maine means access is guaranteed as a right of simply existing. It maintains the dignity of the people, making them Mukramun-honored individuals. They sit face-to-face in equality. They don't kneel at the feet of a strongman.
The contrast is absolute. On one side, you have the stagnant, hoarded wealth of the oppressors. It was built on the broken backs of complicit enablers, and it mathematically must burn itself down to extinguished ashes.
That's the only way it ends.
And on the other side, you have a rational, equitable system where resources flow like a river, maintaining the dignity of every single participant.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you can see how Parwez has mapped an unbroken trajectory. It is a socioeconomic law of physics.
Let's trace it back.
It begins the moment a society is presented with a rational, equitable correction to its flaws.
Right. And instead of engaging with that correction, the society chooses mockery. They smirk to defend their unreasonable hoarding.
And to justify that mockery, they have to deny the ledger. They embrace the dust and bones mentality, convincing themselves that their extraction carries zero long-term consequence.
Which is the fatal error. Once they believe there are no consequences, they build exploitative patronage networks. The elite hoard the water and the passive masses enable them, hoping for just a few drops in return.
But extraction is inherently unstable. The inevitable audit arrives. The server doesn't wipe. The bill comes due.
The false solidarity shatters, and the leaders and enablers tear each other apart in the realization of their mutual ruin.
Resulting in the harvest of ashes. The society collapses entirely under the weight of its own internal rot. Parwez uses the metaphor of drinking poison. Systemic injustice ruins a society from the inside.
It's never magic. It's purely, devastatingly cause and effect. Parwez calls this the ultimate pragmatic test.
Exactly. The proof of any system isn't in its philosophical claims or the beauty of its rhetoric. You can have the most elegant founding documents in the world, but the proof is entirely in the physical, socioeconomic outcome.
Does the system work for the people?
Right. Do your people live with the dignity of flowing water, or are they reduced to the extinguished ashes of an exhausted machine?
So, what does this all mean for us? Think about how we observe the world today. When you see mockery and sarcasm deployed as the primary weapons in our political or corporate debates,
It's a huge red flag.
when you watch massive institutions operating solely for the next fiscal quarter, acting as if there is no tomorrow and no ledger, you aren't just witnessing bad behavior.
No, you are witnessing the precise structural weaknesses Parwez diagnosed. You are watching the early stages of a system quietly gathering the fuel to harvest its own ashes. Which leaves us with a necessary and deeply uncomfortable final question.
Go ahead.
We spend an enormous amount of our time looking upwards. We point our fingers at the corrupt systems, the patrons, the extractors, and we ask how they could be so bad. But based on the brutal reality of the confrontation Parwez outlines, we have to turn that scrutiny inward.
We have to look at ourselves.
We must. We have to look at our own lives and ask, are we the Azwaj? Are we the enablers? Are we pointing our fingers at the architects of the collapse while our own passive complicity, our own fearful silence, provides the very sand upon which their power rests?